There is a particular kind of humiliation reserved for men who believe they are too intelligent to be fooled. I know this because I am one of those men, and I spent 34 years building the kind of professional reputation that is supposed to make such humiliations impossible. I was a legal director for a multinational corporation, with operations on 4 continents. I reviewed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I sat across from some of the most sophisticated fraudsters in the commercial world, men in bespoke suits with law degrees and licensed accountants and entire boards of directors behind them, and I caught them. I caught them because I understood, in a way that most people never fully appreciate, that the legal framework is not your friend. It is a tool, and like any tool, it can be turned against you just as easily as it can be used in your favor. I understood all of this. And then I moved to Bangkok at 67 years old and handed $680,000 to a woman I had known for less than 2 years, signed documents I never read carefully enough, and gave power of attorney to a law firm whose senior partner was her uncle. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the money, though the money is staggering enough, but the fact that I, Richard Holbrook, the man who had spent his entire adult life inside legal institutions, who understood better than almost anyone how legal frameworks protect and betray, stood in a glass-walled office on Silom Road in Bangkok and signed my name to documents that transferred effective control of my entire retirement savings to a family enterprise I had never independently verified. If that can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. That is the only reason I am willing to tell you this. My career began in Chicago in 1981. I graduated from Northwestern with a law degree and no particular plan, took a junior associate position at a corporate firm, and discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was exceptionally good at the quiet, detailed work of institutional legal management. Not the courtroom drama, not the billable hours combat, the infrastructure, the compliance systems, the contract architecture, the risk frameworks that most corporate attorneys found too unglamorous to care about. I cared about them because I had grown up watching my father, a sheet metal worker from Evanston, lose a workers' compensation case in 1976 that he should have won because the company's lawyers had buried the liability in a document he'd signed on his first day and never read. I was 14 years old. I decided, sitting in that courtroom and watching a judge deliver a verdict against a man who had worked 20 years without a single day of absent time, that I would understand documents the way other people understand people. Intuitively, forensically, before they hurt me. There is something else about that courtroom. My father sat perfectly still when the verdict was read. He didn't react. He thanked his own attorney, who had charged him $11,000 and lost cleanly and quickly, and he walked out into the parking lot, and he stood there in the rain for a while, before he got into the car. I watched him from the courthouse steps and I thought, that will not be me. I am going to become someone who that cannot happen to. For 40 years, that belief was not arrogant, it was accurate. And then Bangkok. By the time I retired in 2019, I was the global legal director for a packaging conglomerate with plants in 22 countries and annual revenues north of $3 billion. My compensation package included deferred bonuses that had been building since the mid-90s, structured as a supplement to my pension. When I walked out of that Chicago office for the last time in October of 2019, I was carrying 34 years of accumulated professional identity, $680,000 in liquid assets, a paid-off house in Oak Park that I was considering selling, and no particular idea what to do with any of the next 20 years. My wife Carol had died in 2014, quickly and without sufficient warning, from a cancer that had been present longer than either of us knew. My son lived in Vancouver and called when he remembered, which was not often. My daughter was in London with her husband and 2 children and sent birthday cards that arrived a few days late. I was 67 years old, I was healthy, I was financially solvent, and I was profoundly alone in a house that had been designed for 2 people and now served as a museum of things I no longer knew how to be. A colleague from the Singapore office, a contract manager named Greg Sutherland who had taken early retirement in 2017, had moved to Thailand. He sent me photographs over WhatsApp that I mostly scrolled past without looking at closely. Thailand, I thought. retirement destination for men who don't know what else to do. In January of 2020, just before the world began its long collapse, he sent me a video, his apartment building, the view from his balcony, the Chao Phraya River at dusk, orange and still. He was paying $400 a month for a two-bedroom apartment that was cleaner and better appointed than anything I could have rented in Chicago for 3 times that price. He looked tanned and relaxed and, I thought, 20 years younger than I remembered him from the Singapore conference in 2016. I booked a flight 3 weeks later, telling myself it was a vacation. I half believed that. I arrived in Bangkok in February of 2020, 2 weeks before Thailand closed its borders. That timing sounds like pure disaster in retrospect, but at the time, it worked strangely in my favor. When the pandemic arrived and the country locked down, I was already settled into a serviced apartment in the Silom district, and rather than scrambling to get a flight out, I stayed. Greg was 40 minutes away by BTS. I had my laptop, my pension contributions were automatic, and Bangkok, even quieted by the pandemic, even emptied of its usual density, was unlike anything I had experienced in 40 years of business travel. There is a quality to that city that I find almost impossible to describe accurately without sounding like a fool who has been seduced by something he doesn't understand. It wasn't the food, though the food was extraordinary. It wasn't the temples or the river or the organized chaos of the street life. It was something more specific to my own state of mind at that moment. The sensation that the person I had been for 34 years was, in some fundamental way, optional. That I could be something else, or just be, without the professional identity that had been my entire architecture. I want to be honest about that feeling. I've thought about it a great deal in the years since everything fell apart. That sensation, that my previous life had been a prelude to something that was only now beginning, was not wisdom, it was not insight. It was the first symptom of what was about to happen to me, the first loosening of the judgment that I had spent a career constructing. When a man of 67 who has recently lost his wife, and who lives alone in a city where he knows almost no one, starts to feel that his previous life was somehow beside the point, he is not having an epiphany. He is becoming susceptible. I should have recognized that. I did not. I met Areeya in September of 2020. By then I had been in Bangkok for 7 months. I had moved from the serviced apartment to a 1-bedroom place I was renting on Surawang Road, learned enough Thai to order food and navigate the BTS without assistance, and begun, through Greg's social network, to move in the circles of the Bangkok expat professional community, not the retirement bar circuit in Nana or Patpong, which held no appeal for me whatsoever, but the business class, regional consultants, compliance officers, a few practicing attorneys. It was through this network that I attended a seminar on foreign national investment law, hosted by a firm called Jantara Sambat and Associates, operating out of a well-appointed suite of offices on Silom Road, 12 floors up, with views that on clear days included the green rectangle of Lumpini Park below. The seminar was professionally organized in every particular. 3 attorneys presented on Thai property law as it applied to foreign nationals, on the available corporate vehicles for investment participation, and on recent regulatory changes affecting foreign business licensing. The content was accurate as far as I could assess it, and I assessed it with some rigor, from 34 years of habit. Afterward, there was a reception, wine, canapés, business cards, the easy professional socializing that people in corporate legal circles know how to do in their sleep. That is where I met Areeya Jantara Sambat. She was 35, composed, and dressed in a charcoal suit that was clearly tailored rather than bought off a rack. Her English was precise and slightly British inflected from her time studying in London, and she introduced herself without any of the deferential hesitation that I had encountered in some of my other professional interactions in Bangkok. She was a senior paralegal, she told me, specializing in foreign national property and investment transactions. She had worked in the Singapore office of a larger regional firm before returning to Bangkok to join her family's practice, which had been established by her uncle, the senior partner Kun Wan Chai, who had been in practice for 26 years and was, she said, well regarded in the Silom legal community. Her manner was entirely professional, and, if she was warm, and she was, distinctly warm, it was the kind of warmth that belongs to people who are very accomplished at their work and know it. I did not for one moment, that evening, imagine I was meeting anyone other than exactly who she presented herself to be. I gave her my card. She gave me hers. 3 days later, I called the number on it and made an appointment to discuss my situation. A foreign national with liquid assets looking for legitimate investment structures that might generate modest income without requiring full business involvement. It was a standard opening position. I had conducted versions of that conversation 100 times in my career, from the other side of the desk, and I was comfortable with it. Our first meeting was 90 minutes in a conference room that had the measured neutrality of professional legal space. Glass-walled, art on the walls that was tasteful without being distinctive, a long table with leather chairs, and the specific silence of a room that is always climate-controlled. Areeya was prepared. She had done background research on the investment structures I had referenced in my initial inquiry, and she walked through 3 distinct vehicles with clear analysis of the advantages and disadvantages of each for a foreign national in my specific position. She asked intelligent questions that revealed she had actually thought about my situation, not just assembled generic materials. She did not push. At the end of the meeting, she offered to prepare a preliminary assessment at no cost, noting that the firm preferred to establish whether a genuine fit existed before either party committed to engagement. I told her that was reasonable, and I meant it. It was how I would have conducted the same conversation on my side. Over the following 6 weeks, we met 4 times in that same conference room. Between meetings, she sent documents via email that I reviewed with the habits of a career, looking for unusual language constructions, checking that defined terms were used consistently, cross-referencing clauses that purported to reference each other. Everything appeared standard. I told Greg about her at one point, in early November of 2020. He shrugged over his beer and said the Silom firms were generally reputable, that he'd dealt with a couple himself without trouble. "Just don't sign anything you haven't slept on," he said. I told him that I never did. I remember being very slightly irritated by the implication that I might need that advice. The first shift in the nature of our relationship occurred in December of 2020, when Areeya invited me to what she described as a client appreciation dinner. It was held at a restaurant in Sathon, a proper, quiet restaurant, not a hotel banquet event, and there were perhaps 20 people present. I was introduced to 2 of them as a distinguished American attorney, which I found simultaneously inaccurate and mildly, embarrassingly pleasing. During dinner, I was seated beside her by the arrangement of place settings that I am now certain was not accidental. We spoke, for the first time in our acquaintance, about things other than legal structures and regulatory frameworks. I learned that she had studied in London at UCL, that she ran every morning along the river path near Rama 3, that she had a mordant sense of humor, that she kept carefully contained during working hours. She asked about my life in Chicago, about Carol, about what had brought me to Bangkok beyond the obvious. I told her more than I intended to. When I walked to my taxi afterward and the evening air was the specific warmth that Bangkok has in December, I thought that the dinner had been unexpectedly enjoyable. That was all it was, at the time. At the time, that was genuinely all. By February of 2021, the nature of our relationship had changed in ways that I was actively working not to examine too directly. We had had dinner 3 more times, twice in group settings and once, in January, alone. The alone dinner had been her suggestion. She framed it as an opportunity to discuss some recent regulatory changes informally, outside the structured context of a client meeting. That framing gave me permission to accept, without fully acknowledging to myself, why I wanted to go. The restaurant she chose was small and good, near the Chao Phraya, and the regulatory changes we discussed occupied perhaps 20 minutes of a 3-hour evening. I was 68 years old. She was 35. I am not going to pretend the arithmetic didn't occur to me. What I will tell you is that I dismissed it, and that the dismissal felt principled at the time, mature, even, rather than convenient. I told myself that I was not in the grip of any predictable cliché, that Carol had been gone for 7 years, that I was lonely but not desperate, that Areeya was a professional colleague with whom I was developing a friendship that happened to be enjoyable and that was entirely appropriate on both sides. I was very clear with myself about all of this. What I was not clear about was the degree to which this clarity was manufactured. In March of 2021, this was a Tuesday evening at a riverside hotel bar, the kind of outdoor terrace that Bangkok does well, where the river traffic provides just enough movement to justify sitting in silence. Areeya said, almost as an aside, that she hoped our growing friendship wasn't creating a complication for the firm. I asked what kind of complication she meant. She said, looking at the river rather than at me, that she had become personally fond of me, that the firm had policies about personal relationships with clients, and that she wasn't certain how to navigate the situation because she hadn't expected to feel this way. She said it quietly and with what appeared to be genuine discomfort. I told her that I was equally fond of her and that we were adults, and that I didn't see why a friendship that had developed naturally through a professional relationship needed to be treated as a problem. She smiled. She looked, for a moment, relieved in a way that seemed unguarded. Looking back at that conversation now, and I have looked back at it many times with the benefit of everything I subsequently learned, I can see exactly what it was. She was creating a moment in which I felt I was the senior partner in the relationship, the one exercising mature judgment, the one offering reassurance. I had no idea, sitting there with the river going by and the warm evening air and my glass of wine, how precisely that moment had been designed for me. By the end of April of 2021, we were in a relationship. Not a casual one. She kept things at my apartment on Surawang Road on a semi-permanent basis, and we settled into domestic routines that felt natural in the way that things feel natural when you have been lonely for long enough. I was aware, in a general way, that this was unusual territory for a man in my position, and that some level of caution was warranted. I was not unaware of the stereotype, the cliché, the story that other men had been in, the warning that Greg had delivered without quite delivering it. What I told myself, because I needed to tell myself something, was that the existence of a cliché did not mean that every instance of a pattern was identical. Some men in situations that appear similar have genuinely found what they think they've found. I believed I was one of them. I believed this with the special conviction of a person who knows enough about a danger to feel that their knowledge protects them from it. In June of 2021, Areeya brought to me what she described as a genuinely favorable investment opportunity, a chance to participate in a commercial property development in the Rama 3 corridor of Bangkok through a Thai corporate vehicle, a holding company, that would receive my investment and hold it on my behalf, with her firm managing the legal administration. The projected returns were modest, 6 to 8% annually over a 5-year term, with the underlying property value serving as security. The documentation ran to 47 pages. I reviewed it over 2 evenings. I looked for the things I would have looked for in a commercial context: unusual indemnification clauses, asymmetric termination provisions, definitions that were broader than they needed to be, cross-references that didn't resolve to what they claimed to. I found nothing that alarmed me. The firm that had prepared the documentation was, of course, Jantara Sambat and Associates itself. I noted this. I did not think about what I was noting, which is a different thing from noting it. I invested $120,000. This was the first of 5 tranches over the following 14 months, each structured through a different vehicle, each with its own documentation set, each reviewed and approved by me before the funds moved. I want to be very precise about this because it matters. I was not a passive participant in these transactions. I reviewed the documents, I asked questions. I sometimes pushed back on specific language and received revisions. I conducted myself with a level of professional diligence that would have satisfied any audit. What I did not do, what I could not make myself do, because doing it would have required acknowledging what it would have meant, was commission an independent review by an attorney with no connection to anyone I had met through Areeya or through the firm. In 34 years of corporate legal management, I would never have approved a transaction of this magnitude without independent counsel. In my own retirement, with my own savings, I approved 5 of them through the firm that was managing them. I have spent a great deal of time trying to understand exactly how that happened, and the most honest answer I can give you is this. I trusted her, and I trusted the legal framework she operated within, and I believed that my ability to read documents was sufficient protection against the possibility that the person who gave me the documents had constructed them specifically to resist my reading. Greg mentioned in August of 2021, over dinner at a place we liked near Sukhumvit Soy 11, a story he'd heard from a Canadian expat, a retired civil engineer from Alberta, who had lost a significant sum through a Bangkok legal firm after meeting a woman at a professional conference. The story was told as a cautionary tale in the General Register, not directed at me. Greg is not a man who delivers warnings obliquely on purpose. He's too direct for that. He genuinely was just telling the story. But I felt, listening to it, a brief and very specific cold settling in my chest. The physical sensation of recognition that I immediately identified, named, and suppressed. I changed the subject. I told myself, with the fluency of someone who has been telling himself variations of the same thing for months, that the situations were not analogous. The Canadian had presumably been reckless. I was methodical. I understood what I was signing. My relationship had developed through genuine professional context and then genuine personal connection. I was not some recently widowed retiree being targeted through a bar. I was an experienced legal professional in a relationship that had grown organically from a professional engagement. I repeated this internally for the rest of the evening, which should itself have told me something. The behavioral shift in Areeya occurred gradually enough that I am still not certain exactly when it began. Looking back now, I can see it clearly in the period between December of 2021 and April of 2022, a change in the texture of her manner that was subtle and inconsistent, and therefore easy to explain away in the moment. There were stretches of days in which she was exactly as she had always been, warm, composed, intellectually engaged, present. But there were also evenings when she was distracted in a way that felt different from ordinary tiredness or work stress. Phone calls that took her out of the room. A new pattern of spending more time with her family, including visits to her uncle's office, that she mentioned but didn't elaborate on. A smoothness in her responses to questions about the investments, questions I was asking more frequently now, that I had previously read as professional competence, and that I was beginning, with reluctance, to wonder about differently. In January of 2022, she told me that her mother in Chiang Rai was seriously ill and needed treatment at a private hospital in Bangkok. The amount she needed was 850,000 baht, approximately $24,000 at prevailing exchange rates. She was upset when she told me. I had not seen her genuinely upset before. She was a composed person, and composure appeared to be structural for her, and the sight of it moved me in a way that I am not going to pretend was purely altruistic. I wrote the transfer that evening without sleeping on it, without asking for documentation of the medical situation, without any of the due diligence I would have applied in any other context in my life. I told myself it was a loan. I told myself that people in real relationships help each other through real crises. I told myself that if I demanded documentary proof from the woman I was living with before I helped her sick mother, I was not the person I believed I was. All of these things were true. They were also the mechanism by which I gave away $24,000 without verification. 4 months later, in the latter part of 2022, her brother's printing business in Latfrau encountered what she described as a cash flow crisis, caused by a supplier dispute. The amount needed was 600,000 baht. I transferred it. 2 months after that, a cousin, someone I had met once, briefly, at a family gathering at the house in Bangkok where Areeya's aunt lived, required emergency surgery, another 400,000 baht. I remember noting, at the time of the surgery transfer, that the pattern of emergencies had become something I was aware of. I remember, specifically, the decision not to act on that awareness. I told myself that Thai family culture operates differently from the individualistic financial structures I was accustomed to. that the web of mutual obligation within a Thai family extends to serious obligations that would not have analogues in my own family background, and that imposing my cultural framework on her family's situation would be both arrogant and unkind. I believe this. It is even partly true. But it is also true that I used it as an excuse to avoid the question I should have been asking, which was not about Thai family culture, but about the pattern of emergencies itself and what it meant. The ceiling fan in the bedroom had developed a clicking sound by this period, a rhythmic irregularity in one of the blades, a small sound in the specific stillness of Bangkok nights, and I had been meaning to call the building management for weeks. I remember the clicking in the background of the evening I approved the surgery transfer. I remember eating leftover takeaway noodles from a container on the coffee table and listening to the clicking fan and authorizing the bank transfer on my phone. I don't know why I remember that specifically. I think the brain stores a certain kind of sensory detail when it is in the process of doing something it knows it shouldn't, as if the peripheral details become hyper-real to compensate for the central thing you're refusing to look at. By September of 2022, I had transferred $530,000 through the formal investment vehicles managed by Jantara Sambat and Associates. Combined with the family loans, which totaled approximately $52,000 across 5 separate transfers, and the ordinary costs of 3 years of life in Bangkok, I was approaching full deployment of the liquid capital I had brought to Thailand. I was monitoring my account balances. I was not ignorant of the numbers. What I was not doing, and what I am most ashamed of in all of this, was looking closely at what was actually inside the investment vehicles I had funded. I had reviewed the entry documentation for each one. I had not followed up on internal operations, had not requested the periodic accountings that the documentation entitled me to, had not independently verified the claimed property assets against which my investment was supposed to be secured. This is called delegation without oversight. In 34 years of corporate legal management, it is the single most common failure mode I dealt with in junior attorneys. And I dealt with it sternly, because I understood exactly what it costs, and I was doing it with my own retirement savings because the person I had delegated to was someone I loved, and I had confused trust in a person with verification of a structure, which are not the same thing and have never been the same thing. The call from the bank came on a Wednesday morning in October of 2022. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and the Bangkok Post when the compliance officer from Bangkok Bank, a woman with careful, formal English and a tone that managed to be both apologetic and serious at once, told me that a power of attorney instrument held on my account had authorized a transfer of 8.4 million baht the previous week, and that the bank was conducting a routine review of large authorized transfers and wanted to confirm I had been aware of and had intended this specific transaction. The amount was approximately $235,000 at the exchange rate that week. I told her, in a voice that I can only describe as professionally automatic, the voice I used in 34 years of receiving unwelcome information in boardrooms and depositions and late-night calls from regional offices, to put an immediate hold on the account and to have the transfer documentation available for my review. I told her I would be at the branch within 2 hours. She said she would make arrangements. I ended the call, and I put the phone down on the kitchen table, and I sat there for a long time. The ceiling fan had been repaired by this point. The building management had sent someone in August, 2 months earlier, and the apartment was quiet. I sat in that quiet, and I understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has spent his career interpreting legal language and who is now reading the legal language of his own situation for the first time, what the information I had just received most likely meant. I did not know the details yet, but I knew the shape of it. I knew that the power of attorney I had signed in February, in a session in my own kitchen, at my own table, with Areeya across from me explaining each document in terms that were competent and misleading simultaneously, was probably broader than I had understood it to be, and that it had been used in ways I had not intended and had not verified because I had not read it with the care that I would have given it in any other context of my life. I put on the gray suit. I don't know why I chose the gray suit specifically. I think it was the suit I associated with important professional confrontations. I had worn it to a board meeting in 2011 in which I'd had to inform the executive team that the acquisition they'd approved 6 months earlier contained a liability structure that was going to cost them $40 million. And I had handled that meeting well, and perhaps I was reaching for some residue of that competence. I took a taxi to the branch. I read the documents they showed me. I sat in the branch manager's office, and I read them with the same attention I had given to everything I had ever signed in a professional context. And I found in them exactly what I had feared I would find. The power of attorney I had signed in February of 2022 authorized Jantara Sambat and Associates, specifically Areeya Jantara Sambat and the senior partner Kun Wanchai Jantara Sambat, to conduct banking and investment transactions on my behalf up to limits that were, in the document I had signed, expressed in Thai baht amounts that translated to figures substantially larger than I had appreciated at the time of signing. The instrument had been used across 6 transactions over the preceding 8 months to transfer a total of approximately $415,000 from my personal accounts into accounts held by 3 corporate vehicles whose ultimate beneficial ownership, disclosed nowhere in any document I had signed, resided with members of the Jantara Sambat family. The corporate vehicles were real registered entities. The money had moved through them in ways that were, from a documentation standpoint, consistent with authorized investment activity. The fact that the investments themselves were fictitious, that the properties they purported to secure did not exist in the form represented, that the returns I had been shown as evidence of performance were fabricated, was buried under layers of nominee arrangements and intercompany documentation that was specifically designed to resist the kind of review I had been conducting. I did the arithmetic at the branch manager's desk. Original investment tranches, $530,000. Unauthorized transfers under the power of attorney, $415,000, partially overlapping with the investment amounts. Family loans, $52,000. What I was left with, in all my accounts combined, was $42,000. Of the $680,000 I had brought to Thailand, I had lost $680,000. I sat with that number. I looked at it the way you look at something when you are trying to make it stop being true by the intensity of your attention to it. I called Areeya from the bank's parking structure. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her, in brief and specific terms, what the bank had shown me. There was a pause. Not long, but a particular kind of pause. The pause of a person who is selecting between prepared responses. And then she said she didn't understand what I was describing, and that there must be documentation errors, and that the transfers I was referring to were authorized movements of investment capital between holding vehicles, and that the paperwork would clarify everything. She said she would call me back within the hour. She did not call back within the hour. She called back 2 days later, from a number I didn't recognize, and the conversation that followed was entirely different in character from anything we had had in 2 years. The British-inflected precision of her English had been set aside. She was blunt in a way that had no warmth in it, and what she said, in summary, was that I had entered into these arrangements knowingly and with full documentation, that she had in fact counseled more conservative approaches at various stages, and I had overridden them, that I was a farang, she used the word flatly, without the neutrality that I had heard her apply to it in professional contexts, with something sharper underneath, and that I had come to Thailand expecting favorable treatment and simple returns, and the consequences of those expectations were mine. She said, very specifically, I did this for the business. You understood what the business was. Then she ended the call. I retained an independent Thai attorney within the week, a man named Arthit Suwanarat, who had been recommended by a contact in the Bangkok expat legal community and who had no connection of any kind to anyone I had previously dealt with in Thailand. I sat in his office on Wireless Road with every document I had and put it all in front of him. He spent 4 hours that day, and several more in the following days, working through the materials. When he gave me his assessment, he was direct in the way that good attorneys are direct when the news is serious, without false comfort, but also without theatrical grimness. He told me that the power of attorney was valid under Thai law and that it had authorized substantially everything that had been done. He told me that the corporate vehicles were genuine registered entities whose nominee structures would require months of litigation to penetrate. He told me that the documentation, taken as a whole, had been constructed with considerable sophistication to present every transaction as authorized and commercially reasonable, and that the gap between what the documents said and what had actually happened was a gap I would need to prove, not assume. He told me that the courts in Thailand move slowly, and that his assessment of recovery was uncertain. He told me he was sorry. I asked him if he had seen this pattern before. He said yes. He said, with care, that he saw variations of it with some regularity, and that the distinguishing feature in my case, the thing that made it particularly effective and particularly difficult to unwind legally, was the use of a legitimate licensed law firm as the vehicle, combined with a romantic relationship managed by a family member of the firm. Most similar schemes operated through informal channels, with money moving through personal relationships without legal architecture. This one had used the architecture deliberately because the target's profile, an experienced legal professional with strong confidence in his ability to review and approve documents, required exactly that level of sophistication to bypass his defenses. I had been identified, assessed, and approached in a way that was specifically calibrated to what I was. My professional background, which I had considered my protection, had been the mechanism by which my protection was circumvented. I sat in Arthit's office for a while after he finished. He made tea without asking if I wanted any, which was the right thing to do. At some point I told him about my father's workers' compensation case. The document signed on the first day of work that he never read. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. He didn't tell me the situations were analogous or that they weren't. He just let me say it. Then he said we should discuss next steps, which was also the right thing. I called Greg that evening. He came over without being asked and without making any of the faces that would have been available to him. He did not say "I told you so." He did not ask what either of us could have done differently, at which point, which is a question that serves no purpose, and that he was smart enough to know serves no purpose. He asked what I needed. I said I needed to think, and that his company would help with that. We sat on my balcony with a bottle of scotch, a Glenfarclas 18-year that I had been keeping for no specific occasion, and we talked about other things for a while, which is the most useful thing a friend can do when the useful things have already been fully said. I left Bangkok in January of 2023. I sold what I could reasonably sell: furniture, a good camera, a bicycle I'd bought in the second year and used considerably, 2 suitcases, and a carry-on. My apartment on Surawang Road was a rental, so there was nothing to negotiate about that, just the formality of ending the lease and collecting the deposit. On my last morning in Bangkok, before my taxi came, I walked along the river. I had walked that path on most mornings for 2 years, and it was familiar in the way that a place becomes familiar when you've moved through it in enough different states of mind. Happy, preoccupied, tired, content, and now this. I don't know what the right word is for what I felt. Grief isn't quite right, because grief implies loss of something you were entitled to, and I'm not sure what I was entitled to. Reckoning is closer. The specific feeling of understanding something fully and too late, and knowing that the understanding is now all you're going to get from the experience. I have been back in Chicago since February of 2023. I moved back into the Oak Park house, which I had not sold. The pending sale had fallen through during the pandemic, and I had made no further effort to progress it in the years since. Partly from inertia, and partly, I think, from some unexamined reluctance to close that door permanently. That inertia is the one piece of accidental fortune in this entire story. I have the house. I don't have the $638,000, and I don't have what that money was supposed to represent: the freedom of a well-funded retirement, the ability to not count what things cost. But I have a house, and I have the consulting work I've been doing for a small commercial compliance firm on the north side, and I have my health, and I have Greg on WhatsApp, and I have my daughter calling more often from London in a way she does now without explaining why. These are not nothing. I want to be accurate about that. They are not nothing. The litigation is ongoing. Arthit is pursuing the matter with the tenacity of someone who understands both the legal complexity and the personal stakes, and with the realistic expectation of partial recovery that I have also come to hold. What has emerged through the investigation is that Jantara Sambat and Associates appears to have operated a version of this scheme for at least a decade, targeting high net worth foreign retirees specifically, and that there are at minimum 4 other foreign nationals whose cases overlap with mine in various ways. The scheme was systematic. The selection of targets was deliberate. The approach was tailored, in each case, to the specific profile of the individual. My profile: experienced legal professional, widowed, recently retired, solvent, living alone in Bangkok, generated a specific strategy, and that strategy was executed against me with considerable competence. Here is what I want to say to you, carefully and without drama, because I am a man who spent his career distinguishing between things that merely sound alike and things that actually are alike. I did not lose $638,000 because Thailand is a dangerous country. It is not. I did not lose it because Thai women are untrustworthy. They are not, as a class, any less or more trustworthy than women anywhere else on earth. I did not lose it because romantic relationships across cultural or age differences are inherently suspect. Some of them aren't. I lost it because I applied profoundly different standards of scrutiny to what happened inside my emotional life than I applied to what happened inside my professional life, and I dressed that differential up as sophistication when it was actually the oldest and most ordinary vulnerability there is. I lost it because I delegated legal matters of the greatest possible personal consequence to people whose interests I had not independently examined, in a context where I had an enormous internal incentive to avoid finding out anything that would complicate what I wanted to believe. I lost it because the most sophisticated fraud is always dressed in the most legitimate clothing, and a law firm letterhead, a professional business card, and a warm handshake after a well-organized seminar are not the same thing as loyalty. They are not even in the same category of thing as loyalty. I knew that. I taught it for 34 years. I just couldn't apply it to myself. If you are a foreign national in Thailand, or anywhere else, contemplating significant financial commitments through or with a romantic partner who also has professional involvement in managing those commitments, I need you to stop and sit with the conflict of interest that creates. The conflict of interest is not smaller than you think it is. It is larger. It doesn't matter how much you trust her. It doesn't matter how long the relationship has been developing. It doesn't matter that you've reviewed the documents yourself. Get independent legal counsel. Not the firm she's associated with. Not a firm she recommended. Not a firm that anyone in your immediate social circle in Thailand recommended without independent verification. Independent counsel from a source you have developed entirely separately. Have the documents translated by a translator you hired independently. Request periodic accounting of any investment vehicle with your money in it. Verify that the assets claimed to secure your investment actually exist in the form represented, through a source that has no connection to the person managing your money. This will feel excessive. It is not excessive. It is the minimum. My father lost his workers' compensation case in 1976 because he signed a document on his first day of work and never read it. I was 14 years old, and I made a decision, watching him stand in the rain outside that courthouse, that I would become someone to whom that could not happen. I spent 54 years being that person. And then I went to Bangkok and signed a power of attorney at my own kitchen table, and became exactly that person, with a more sophisticated document and more elaborate circumstances, and the same result. The rules of due diligence do not change because you're in a different country, or because you're in love, or because the person sitting across from you when you sign has spent 2 years making you feel like the senior partner in the relationship. Understanding the rules has never been the same thing as following them. I knew that, and then I didn't. I don't know what I will do with the rest of the years I have. I work, I call my daughter, I walk in the mornings through Oak Park where I grew up, and where my father lived the whole of his life. On some mornings I think about the river in Bangkok, the orange stillness of it at dusk, the way the city felt at 6 in the morning before the heat arrived. I don't think about Areeya with anger anymore. What I feel about her is closer to the feeling you have toward a dangerous thing that was doing exactly what a dangerous thing does. The anger is mostly at myself, and mostly at the specific place in myself where competence and confidence became indistinguishable, where knowing how fraud works became the reason I could not see it working on me. That is the thing worth understanding, if you take anything from this. The more certain you are of your own judgment, the more carefully you need to arrange your life so that your judgment isn't the last line of defense.